There's a whole process that these patients go through, and it's such an uphill climb, even on the best of a case, to get to that 6 to 8 week mark where they're healing. If you think about a cabbage or a valve, they're opening up the mediastinum, cracking the sternum, chest is wired back shut. So there's a whole process of very engaged healing that is happening at all levels, and they're trying to get back into cardiac rehab. They're discharged home in 3 to 4 days. And if they come back not feeling well with a post-op infection, whether it's minor or major, it really sets them back.
Clock in, scrub up, and join us behind the red line. You're listening to First Case, a perioperative podcast bringing you exciting interviews, engaging discussions, and innovative solutions that are changing the way patients receive surgical care. Each episode, we talk to frontline staff, perioperative leadership, and nursing entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the back table to the boardroom, from wheels in to wheels out, we tackle the real-life issues affecting the OR. Whether you're tuning in for surgical service education or inspiration, we're glad you're here. And now it's time to roll back and start the first case.
On this episode of First Case, we speak with Ruth Statchura, Vice President of Business Development at SeaChange. And Melanie, this is coming on the heels of our conversation last Friday, but here we are right in the middle of Infection Prevention Week, and Ruth's going to help us hit this, really focusing on cardiac surgery today.
I'm really excited. I don't know a lot about CVOR. I have spent many years in the OR, but never set foot into a cardiac surgery. So talking to her and learning more about infection prevention and what we're looking for with our cardiac patients is interesting to me, and I'm excited to get to talk to her today.
All right, we'll be right back with Ruth. Stay with us.
I'm Melanie Perry.
And I'm Justin Poulin.
From the studios of Healthcare HQ, you're listening to First Case.
We are speaking with Ruth Statchura, Vice President of Business Development at SeaChange today, talking about infection prevention, specifically in cardiac surgery. And Ruth, we had a chance to talk to you last Friday about the many endeavors that you have in healthcare today and kind of your background. But I wanted to welcome you back to the show for our season on infection prevention.
Thank you. It's good to be here again.
So in case they missed Friday's interview, why don't you tell the audience a little bit about your background and your experience as a nurse?
Sure. Like probably several of you, you've had a little bit of a circuitous career as a nurse, including me. I started off with an undergrad in nursing and I fell in love with the cardiovascular world and the OR. I got picked up reasonably young in my career. I kept working per diem, but on the device side. And I have migrated through a lot of different roles on the medical device side, mostly on the surgical side, heavy on cardiac. And I'm currently with SeaChange Surgical, as you said, Vice President of Business Development. And I was very intrigued with their technology because, like you, I care about infection prevention. I care about better outcomes and the economic impact of what we do on the device side. So we can talk more about that, but enter our conversation.
So before we really dive into the conversation, why don't we start with just really highlighting the risks associated with infection, in cardiac surgery? Why don't we just start off by highlighting those risks that our patients that are having cardiac surgery experience?
Yeah, that's a good question. Like a lot of patients in the OR, they have a lot of comorbidities, particularly diabetes or something that's prone more to an infectious disease state. Now, every patient in the OR, we're concerned about SSI prevention. That's all the AORN initiatives about airflow and open air, things that are open to air with water and air pathogens, in particular with cardiac surgery. One, and how we're involved on the surgical slush side, the mediastinum is open, the repair is done, and the mediastinum is closed. So, that's a big surgery unless they're doing a minimally invasive robotic valve or, something like that. But also slush is used in transplantation. Those are also high risk patients on a lot of immunosuppressors. So we are concerned about infection prevention in both those categories of patients.
Well, I mean, we can obviously assume that if a patient is having surgery on their heart, something is not right, and we're working to fix it. So their health is probably already compromised. And all of these experiences in the operating room can only serve to maybe increase their risk of infection, plus their comorbidities adding to that. And so we do want to do everything we possibly can to prevent them from getting an infection. So if we want to dive deeper into, what's going on with, you talked about these fluid loving or fluid avid pathogens. What's going on, or what is the risk associated with those?
Well, they're very hard to treat. Mycobacterium are not a friendly bug in one's body. And we're already talking about the patients being immunocompromised. So if you're looking at ways that we can prevent open fluids, or because we don't really know what's growing, like for example, the technology that I'm involved in, if there's an open slush system and there's a drape over it, you don't really know what's living below it. If there's a drape leak, and we hear all the time that, hey, there's drape leaks, you can't be sure what bacteria or mycobacterium in particular would be there. So we're just trying to eliminate the use of anything that is more of an open system or open basin. That goes for airflow and for fluid. I think that's pretty, AORN has definitely looked at that from a guideline perspective in the past few years.
You've mentioned surgical slush a couple of times, and yes, we really highlighted that on Friday in our vendor spotlight, but just educating our listeners on surgical slush, they might not be working in CVOR or a transplant, might not be familiar with it. What is surgical slush and how does it work?
Oh, great question. Surgical slush is primarily used for cardiovascular and transplant surgeries. There are a few other cases that we see, some neuro cases, some parenchymal cases that we've seen surgical slush used. But the intent of it is to provide something that is sterile, that helps cool either the myocardium or the organs, for end organ preservation and maximizing oxygenation during a procedure like CABG or a valve or a transplant. So if it is used on a patient, you want to make sure you have the highest quality slush so that it's atraumatic to the organ. And ideally, and this is where SurgiSlush was developed, we heard it from customers. Our CEO set out to address that because the technology that's used really has been since the 1980s. And our customers and clinicians told us there's got to be a better way to deliver surgical slush safely in a more infection prevention modality, which is what we've done.
So let's first talk about surgical slush, though, in the sense of how it can increase risk of infection. What are the risks there?
So again, we had started off talking about air and fluid avid pathogens. So what is standard procedure, and it's one of those things that we all just have known about and we kind of look and we ignore it. So on a normal case, the slush is set up, first thing in the morning, maybe 6:30. It's in an open basin. And by the time they're using it, by the time they're ready to go to bypass, it's probably 9-ish. We found that the average time that slush is open until use is 3 hours and 7 minutes, which sounds kind of shocking because, we all think it's a shorter amount of time. So the problem with that per se, and that's why we're trying to eliminate a lot of back and forth traffic through the OR and airflow, but you do have something that's just sitting there open that is normal saline. Yes, it's sterile, but the longer something sits out, the longer the risk increases, or the more the risk increases.
So, Ruth, I mean, obviously nobody wants to get an infection regardless of the service line that we're talking about. But when we're talking about somebody's heart, I feel like that's just an area of even increased risk of complications, like what that treatment is like if somebody has had an infection after a cardiac surgery. And I'm just kind of wondering, what are some of those complications? And even then, like, how bad can it be versus maybe one that's a little bit more of a minor infection that's treatable? I feel like there's a continuum there of what could go wrong if a patient were to get an infection.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen a lot of those patients over my career, and it's really, there's a whole process that these patients go through, and it's such an uphill climb, even on the best of a case, to get to that 6 to 8 week mark where they're healing. If you think about a cabbage or a valve, they're opening up the mediastinum, cracking the sternum, chest is wired back shut. So there's a whole process of very engaged healing that is happening at all levels, and they're trying to get back into cardiac rehab. They're discharged home in 3 to 4 days. And if they come back not feeling well with a post-op infection, whether it's minor or major, it really sets them back. And we had talked about that. They're already likely presenting with comorbidities such as diabetes or immunocompromised, or just, they're generally older by the time they'd have a cabbage or a valve, and maybe they have other vascular comorbidities. So if they did a vein graft from the leg, that affects their walking, they get, pain. And then it always seems like these patients, even under the best, just get a little bit depressed in that 2 to 3 week post-op. I know my dad had a cabbage, and I saw it with him too, and he was a runner his whole life. It doesn't matter how healthy you are. I think you just expect to heal and repair in the fastest way you can. And even the slightest infection sets you back clinically and emotionally.
No, it really does. And having that fear of having to come back to the hospital, maybe to have surgery again, or to have to go through that pain of that incision again. I mean, I can't imagine the long-term ramifications of a massive infection for a patient.
Well, the one thing I did read that seemed shocking was the CDC from this year, January 2023, said SSI is the most costly HAA type, with an estimated annual cost to our healthcare system of $3.3 billion. Now, there's not a lot of margins in healthcare. So that is why SSI prevention is such a key focus for most hospital systems, because it's costly, and preventing it certainly would be the wiser economically all the way around.
Oh, absolutely. And you think HAI, a hospital-acquired infection, and then you go deeper into it, SSI, which is a surgical site infection, and the SSIs are the most expensive. Those surgical site infections are costing our patients, they're costing our hospitals, our physicians, they're costing everybody all around. And so yes, avoiding them at all costs is really the way to go. So then thinking, because we are really highlighting cardiac surgery today and anywhere in the operating room as well, but how can we avoid increasing our patients' risk of infection? What can we do? What can we be watching for, maybe specifically to cardiac or just in general, that we can do to help prevent it?
I think AORN has done a really good job with addressing that, constantly putting out new guidelines. There's new sterilization guidelines. If you think about an SSI, it can really come from any point in that surgical chain, whether it's how clean the room is, how did SPD clean the instruments? Was the patient prepped properly? Was there an air contaminant? Was there a fluid contaminant? I mean, there are so many things in the chain of the host of infection that anything that we can do in that chain to have better practices. I know that's where AORN has spent a lot of time and provided guidance to the ORs. And it's all of our responsibility to execute on that.
I agree. Vigilance is very important. We were talking earlier in the interview about things like airflow and paying attention to how many people are in the room and the coming and going and opening the door. And we've had previous interviews with people talking about the airflow in the room and how just opening that door can reset so much of the environment that we've created in our rooms. And then also paying attention to those open containers and things that might allow bacteria to thrive and grow. All the things that we can do to be vigilant to protect our patients.
So, Ruth, I mean, obviously we talked very specifically about surgical slush both last Friday and as we were, kind of getting into this conversation. But cardiac surgery in general, are there some unique challenges to infection prevention related to this service line? Or, maybe there are just some common concerns that come up, other areas of opportunity that really require vigilance from the staff that are supporting, cardiac surgeries?
Yeah, I mean, we had talked about that a little bit before. I just anecdotally, I used to look at, the patient's chart and see, you look at their H&P and you see their comorbidities. I'm sure the stat is out there on how many of them have diabetes as an underlying one, but a problem with diabetes is they're hard to heal. So there is a lot of diabetes just by nature of the disease, and then CAD, cardiac. I mean, we talked, most of them are demographically a little bit older. And then on the transplant side, I mean, those patients are critical in terms of their care and managing their immunocompromised state. So we're looking at two groups of patients that are highly vulnerable, again, specific to slush. Melanie, you had mentioned the airflow and people going in and out. That's exactly why on the freezer side of it, the freezer can be outside the room, dedicated to wherever, multiple rooms. And then the slush is in the sterile internal container closed until they're ready to use it. So really the ambient time to air is as minimal as the clinician wants to make it on the field. And that's just one little niche of the entire surgery, but it's clearly, it's who I'm working for, and this is what we do. And it's one of the, when I first started talking to C Change, it was just this light bulb that went on, like, wow, that is one of the practices that has not been addressed. And we had a clinician who said, we have changed everything in our OR in the last 15 years except for our slush. And that made me think too, because I was equally guilty of that, just not really noticing, because you're just so used to seeing it that, wow, that's open and sitting there.
What are some other improvements that you've seen? I know, again, this season really talking about infection prevention, but like you said, we've already made all these other, improvements over the last, 2 decades, essentially. What are some examples of some big time improvements that have been made that you've seen have helped really, move the industry forward and deliver better care to patients?
Well, I think specific to the OR, the things that we've really seen, and I know you've done podcasts on them. I mean, there's a lot of attention to smoke, even though that's not technically, necessarily an infection agent. The airflow and the improved airflow systems that hospitals have put in addition to investing in their quality water systems, seen that. There's also been a lot of companies who have, and I know that you've hosted them too, who have done a lot on just the cleaning side of things, cleaning agents, either on the patient prep or on all of the things that are in the OR. And then there's also new tech that's come out on the SPD side with sterilization. Everything, all of those are important. And infection prevention in the OR. And we're still not there. We still could do it better. It's still a moving target, but we have come a long way. And if any of you have ever gone out to see a cardiac OR in another country, I mean, it's amazing that we still have SSI and yet we're so good. So that just shows you that they're out there.
And there's always ways to improve. And there's always ways that we can get better. And there's always something that we can do to make it better for our patients.
I think that water quality piece is definitely one that is gaining a lot of momentum and clarity. I feel like a lot of it is led by industry guidelines and, recommended practices. And I feel like that's always a driver, but there's a technology that comes in on the front end of that, or there's a study that comes in on the front of that and then leads that innovation or that, that focus. And I know Amy's got, a work group, and I think actually their recommendation may be coming out right around the time we're interviewing right now with their guideline and Amy's standard around water quality. And it's definitely a big move. Do you feel like, and we talked a little bit about this on Friday, but do you feel like medical device reports or that MAUDE database helps lead that innovation, or how does that all come together for you in your mind?
Well, it's interesting how many clinicians are not aware of MAUDE reporting. And we had said that's manufacturer and user facility device experience, which is our way of reporting to the FDA of an incident. Now, we also talked that it's very unclear the percentage of things that actually make it to a MAUDE report. There's a lot of things going so fast and furiously in a case that sometimes when the drape is off, and we've heard it, oh, well, that's just condensation. Oh, well, that wasn't really a leak. And I won't go into all the specifics on why that's not true, but I just think there's a lot of unreported. And then maybe it's 6-8 weeks down the road, patient has an incident. It's very hard to tie that back to a specific chain in the operative process that said, okay, well, that's what's caused the SSI or the issue. So, I do know that for 12 consecutive years, there's been MAUDE reports about drape leaks. So back full circle to your question about things that we can do to help prevent infection in the OR. Certainly good quality drapes, eliminating the use of them altogether, which is relative specific to this surgical slush side of it. But just generally speaking, just eliminating all of the points that could cause a problem that we can.
Yeah, it goes back to that vigilance thing, paying attention and maybe being open-minded to what we have going on in our operating rooms and seeing it with some fresh eyes every now and then, and making sure that the way we've always done it might not necessarily be the way we need to be doing it today, and being willing to change practices so that we can stay up to date and have the best practice we can to prevent infection.
Yes.
So, Ruth, obviously this season is all about infection prevention, but this episode is also very much focused on cardiac surgery. And not everybody out there listening, has had experience in cardiac. And I almost wonder if it'd be good for us before we even wrap this interview to just talk a little bit about what is it that makes, cardiac surgery unique from maybe the other service lines. Like, what is different, if you're working in cardiac surgery? What's different for you than other service lines?
I think it's a little bit of a club. Once people find that team, they love it, and they're on the cardiac team if possible forever. But just obviously I'm on the slush side of it, but just observationally, what I've seen changed over the years. We used to get patients much cooler than they are now. So you're cooling patients both with ice and then with cardioplegia to maximize myocardial oxygen preservation and to cool them as least amount of time as possible at the perfect temperature where hopefully they pop back off bypass easily. So other things that have changed with cardiac, there's definitely a move to have less of an incision because, it used to be xiphoid almost down to your, it's a huge mediastinal cut. So more minimally invasive techniques. And also with the advent of a lot of technology on the interventional cardiology side, the patients who can be treated in the cath lab what we're seeing is the patients who make it into the cardiac OR, they're sicker than they ever were because they weren't able to be treated with all of these other, like TAVR or other minimally invasive things that you could do in the hybrid suite or in the cardiac cath lab.
Yeah, that's really interesting. We already talked about comorbidities being a risk, but that is a really important distinction that the patients that are coming in for these surgeries are sicker than they used to be. because this used to be where you would start. And now, to your point about minimally invasive surgeries and, just trying to be as least invasive as possible, we're doing so much more that way. And that in and of itself reduces the infection risk.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly helps. One of the trouble areas that I have seen in patients when they had the big saphenous graft, from a cabbage, obviously not a valve, but with movement and chafing, those incision sites just they were painful for the patients and they would get infected. And so there's different technology on saphenous vein graft harvesting where they're able to get the vein out with not as big of an incision. And, because it used to be almost groin level down to the calf. So throughout the entire stage of the surgery, over time, like other service lines, there are improvements and changes.
I remember those scars because when I was going to nursing school, I was working as a CNA and I was on a rehab floor, and many of the patients were cardiac rehab, stepping down and then eventually going home. And I remember those scars were absolutely significant. And is it any different post-operatively in terms of recovery time and outcomes for patients to be able to move around? I almost feel like it's more important, but this is a hunch on my part, that you get these patients up and running and moving again. And so like the pain from the surgery, the post-operative pain can be a real deterrent to that, right? And any medication that you're on can be a deterrent to that. I'm assuming you want them moving around as quickly as possible, if not more than even other procedures like orthopedics.
Oh, you're 100% right. I know it seems barbaric, but let's say the first case comes out at 10:30, 11 in the CVICU. Those patients are usually sitting up that same night if they're extubated and things are going okay. So you want those patients moving. And every patient that I saw on the post-op side, that's what they don't complain about the mediastinum, didn't even complain about the chest tubes that much. It was always that leg incision pain. So that's just, we're going down one avenue of the whole patient, and you want them moving around as quickly as possible. So anything that reduces pain, less incision time, complications, they got to move.
Is the risk of stroke higher in cardiac surgery than others as well? I mean, it could just be related to the fact that, like you said, the comorbidities like diabetes obviously predisposes you to a higher stroke risk. And anytime, the blood has an opportunity to pool, we're worried about that. And obviously we're treating that, prophylactically with blood thinners. But is there a higher risk of stroke just due to the nature of the procedure, or is it more the demographics of the patient?
There is. I mean, these patients in their workup are obviously screened for carotids, et cetera. But if you think about, and, yes, they are on blood thinners, and part of the whole perfecting of the perfusion process is making sure that, all of these things are being looked at. But if you're cross-clamped, you're cross-clamping the aorta, then you release the cross-clamp. And also you're doing saphenous vein grafting when there's a lot of different spots in that surgery where someone could get some sort of embolic event. There's been literature about microembolic events over the years. Those sometimes are hard to trace, they're hard to diagnose. But I think on the micro side, that's definitely a concern. And there is a thing called pump psychosis that exists in these patients afterwards. And, even though it's chemical, is it, or was it microembolic? These are all questions that are hard to put a finite answer on sometimes.
Pump psychosis, I've not heard that term. Can you define that?
Well, it's kind of nebulous because it doesn't really show up for patients this is why I was saying anything that they're moving and seeing they're improving, but maybe couple weeks post-op or even before that. I mean, none of these patients ever remember their post-op course in the hospital, but there is some reporting, especially from the family members, that he's not remembering anything, or he's depressed, or he's not acting right. And so it's kind of lumped into this not so professional term of pump psychosis, but in some of the perfusion journals, there's articles about it, and a lot of it's anecdotal, but it is noted in that population that, there is a process. after cardiac surgery. And if you think about all the manipulation and what's happened when you go on cardiopulmonary bypass, I mean, you're being perfused outside of your body. That's fairly invasive.
All right, Ruth. Well, this episode is going to be released during Infection Prevention Week, so you have the limelight, so to speak. And we obviously have 8 episodes going out over 2 different months highlighting infection prevention considerations in the operating room. But you're going to be the one that goes out during Infection Prevention Week. So is there anything you'd like to add, just maybe even globally, on infection prevention and its importance, and maybe even partnering with infection preventionists? Or maybe there is an IP that's listening right now. Maybe they don't necessarily know the nuances of cardiac, or some of them may not even work that closely with surgery. Anything that you might want IPs to be aware of?
Well, I love the question, and I have seen the evolution of the IP departments going from, the bottom of the hospital now to a more elevated spot, because infection prevention does matter. It is a huge costly or cost. Not only is it cost savings, but there's also positive payments to be made on programs who don't have hack and who, can eliminate SSI. So I think for the IP side of this is any technology, just to keep it generic, where either a piece of technology or a modality of doing something that can be an infection prevention asset, you'd want to partner with those types of companies who can help you with that, because I think there's a lot out there. There's always a cost versus benefit to some of these things, but on the big ones, and I know I concentrated on airborne contaminants and fluid avid pathogens because it's kind of close to my heart right now, but those are big ones.
Close to your heart, no pun intended.
No pun intended.
Nobody could see your face, but I could tell that the pun was not intended, but it was a great way to close the conversation. Ruth, you nailed it. Great job. It was a pleasure having you on the podcast last Friday to talk about the great work you're doing with your company, and then to also just educate our audience, especially those that aren't working in cardiac surgery, about those considerations, and just broadening the knowledge base from the listeners that tune into First Case every week. I just want to thank you very much.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
That was Ruth Statchura, Vice President, Business Development at C-Change. And Melanie, on Friday, we had a great conversation about the work that she's doing at C-Change. But today really obviously started with that area of expertise and her focus day-to-day currently, but really broadened that whole conversation to all the considerations and the evolution of, just how we do cardiac surgery over the last several decades. I think is great. And, you've not worked in cardiac surgery. And we do have Lindsay Joyce on the team, who is very familiar with cardiac surgery. But, one of the things that I just love about conversations like today's is I do think that having, even if you work in a very specific service, having a broad understanding of the considerations of all the different service lines is really hugely important. And even understanding just where the risk of infection comes into play. Obviously, that's our theme for this season. And as Ruth mentioned at the end, there was a lot of focus, on airborne and waterborne pathogens. But it's a big picture, and it's something that I think everybody's got to be considerate of. And when it comes down to the cardiac patient, how quickly can we get them moving around again? And what is a specific concern for them?
Yeah, I think she really provided a lot of good insight, especially as we talk about infection prevention, specifically with our cardiac patients, because the CVOR is a niche within a niche. You have specialties within the OR, even though the OR is itself a specialty. And many of us just don't get into the CVOR. We don't see it. We might not ever set foot into it. And so being able to hear about that, to learn about that, to add to our knowledge base, so that if we should end up joining a CVOR team, or if we are taking care of cardiac patients, we have this knowledge base. And I think Ruth did a really good job of just giving us that basic information and really helping us understand the risks that our cardiac patients are exposed to.
Yeah, and if you're out there and you are a cardiac nurse and this is your jam, as Ruth told us after we wrapped up, she said, cardiac's my jam. If it's your jam, we'd love to hear from you. Maybe you have something to add to the conversation. Definitely comment in the LinkedIn post or the Facebook post for this episode. We'd love to hear from you. Certainly continue to build on this conversation, increasing awareness. And on behalf of Melanie and myself, thanks for listening to this week's episode of First Case.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of First Case. As a reminder, you can help support us by subscribing to First Case on your favorite podcast app or by downloading the smartphone app on iPhone or Android. Simply search for First Case in the App Store or Google Play. The best thing about downloading the smartphone app is that you can access bonus content for certain episodes and view episodes in certain categories, like articles on the go and vendor spotlights. Are you following us on LinkedIn or Facebook yet? If you are and you love an episode or post, then let your social network know about it. Like, comment, or share our posts along with your thoughts and keep the conversation going. If you have any topics or guests that you would like to recommend for a future episode, just send us an email to info@firstcasemedia.com. We look forward to hearing from you.